Good evening, NNJR. I'm Shannon Muller. Thank you for joining us tonight. You may be joining us at the conclusion of the annual business meeting, which was a prior Zoom as well as in person at the VFW in Morris Plains. I'd like to congratulate the new officers and governors for 2022. President Richard Barry, Vice President Lester Chang, Secretary Cindy Cristello, Treasurer Kim Mayavoli, Governor Doug Holcomb, Governor Hubert King, and Governor Rudy Samsel. On behalf of the NNJ board, I'd like to congratulate you all on your new role within the club. I wish you success, and we are looking forward to see what you guys do. And I'm sure we'll hear more about that. But tonight, I'd like to thank Dyke, Hensen, and Dennis Macchio for joining us tonight to have a end of year track discussion. I know they've got a lot they want to cover, so I am not going to hold this up. I would like to in advance wish everyone a happy Thanksgiving. I hope you get time with your family next week and you take the time to really enjoy every moment. Thanksgiving is the best day of the year. Also, please check out our website for details on the December 5th holiday party. You want to sign up for that as soon as you can, and that's on a Sunday afternoon. So please check that out. And also check the website for details on next month's webinar event. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Dyke and Dennis. So thank you for joining us, and I'll send in any questions you guys get to Dyke. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Shannon. And let me be not the first, but many of the people that congratulate you on pulling off this unbelievable series of shows and seminars. It's been remarkable, and he's in the background there. Matt Muller, thank you very much for all your technical expertise that lets us pull this off. All right, now about a year ago we had Dennis on, and it was an excellent presentation. Since that time, over 600 people have viewed Dennis's presentation on our YouTube channel. He has logged well over 100 hours of viewing. That's a lot of education. So thank you very much for that, Dennis. I had the pleasure and the fortune of meeting Dennis 2 years ago, though we might have crossed paths in the late 80s, early 90s when he was managing the iconic Bridgehampton Raceway. I remember going up to Dennis and saying, I remember every spin that I've ever done, and there's one that I can't recall how it happened. I explained the turn, and he said, oh, did you see the little dip in the pavement there? And so a 30-year mystery was solved by me, for me, by Dennis, that there was a little undulation in the pavement that I never saw on the exit of a turn. So we're going to talk about some of that stuff tonight, which is fun. You might know Dennis from his racing career in the 70s and 80s. He raced GT cars. His love is still Formula cars. He managed Bridgehampton for I think over 10 years. And then he returned to his true love, and that's teaching people how to drive quickly, safely, and to win races. And for over 2 decades, he was the president of the Bertel Roos Racing School. Many of the people that we meet say, yeah, I worked with you back in whenever, and hey, would you be interested in teaching my kid the same thing you taught? Dennis spearheaded a lot of the innovation in that school and really pushed education through intense seminars on preparing yourself, preparing your car, really made a mark in the industry. So we're very, very, very lucky to have Dennis with us tonight. The subject of this is probably more for the intermediate to advanced driver. And this is when you start pushing yourselves, how to keep your small mistakes small and minimizing the mistakes from becoming a mistake that you regret. We have a pretty full night. We're going to be allowing people to type in questions. We hope to leave about 15, 20 minutes at the end for people to ask their questions and let Dennis answer it. I want everybody to know, if you send in questions and we don't get to it, we'll follow up. We'll give you personal emails on. How about that? All right. So Dennis, welcome back.
Thank you.
Over to you, buddy.
It's always good to work with your chapter of the PCA, one of the more progressive chapters that I run into, and this is a testament to it. And tonight, I'd like to talk a little bit about, and I'll probably use notes more than I usually do because there's so much good information I think that I hopefully can pass on to people that will make them better at doing this and safer at doing this. So I'm anxious to get going. So you let me know when I can let loose.
Let it rip.
Okay. In all of the schools that I've done, I always start off a school with talking about fear. And in the world of racing, because it is a sport that requires a certain amount of courage, almost nobody ever admits to the fact that they have some fear when they hit a racetrack, but the reality is everybody does. And part of the reason they have fear is because if they make a mistake out there, it could be very costly in terms of equipment and even in some cases, their own health. So people don't like to admit to fear. They've got it. In many cases, they don't know how to utilize it as a tool as opposed to a detriment. I've noticed over the years that the fear comes in a lot of different packages. Some people are afraid of getting hurt. Some people are afraid of damaging their car. Some people are afraid of failure. Some people, perhaps with a spouse or a significant other looking on, don't want to look like a fool. Some people don't want to lose races, but in all cases, virtually everybody that hits the track has some level of fear. They don't like to admit it. They don't recognize that it is a tool, and they struggle with how to handle it on a racetrack. One of the ways they handle it, most drivers, except when you get to really the top tiers, is they drive well below their threshold, maybe 90% of a car's capacity. They leave a little wiggle room, if you will, to be able to make mistakes and survive them without making any critically difficult problems on the track for themselves. So tonight, what I thought I would talk about in respect to that fear is a thing that I've labeled over the last few years, the parachute system. And the reason it's called the parachute system is I found over the years of teaching that if you put a name on something and you provide a systemic approach to that something, people will listen more carefully than if it's an arbitrary conversation about what to do when you spin a car and things of that nature. I learned that, frankly, at New Jersey Motorsports Park when I was teaching a rather radical line to what other people were driving on the lightning course, going through their turns 2, 3, and 4. And during track walks, a lot of people would be very skeptical because it was outside of the textbook in terms of corner compromising. And one day I came up with the bright idea of calling it a reverse compromise, as if that term had existed for decades. And all of a sudden, everybody's heads went up and down and go, oh yeah, reverse, counter compromise, reverse compromise, we get it. And all of a sudden they started to do it. So the parachute system is kind of a similar thing. I'm a huge believer, having taught for all of these years, that when you have a systemic approach to something, if you have a methodical approach to something, it makes it more easy to understand, much more easy to understand, and it sticks with you a longer time. So I developed this thing called the parachute system. To explain it pretty quickly, imagine yourself getting onto a jet plane, a private jet plane, maybe a corporate Learjet or something. And as you get on board, you look at the cockpit and you see a 90-year-old, not that there's anything wrong with being 90, I'm getting close myself. You see a 90-year-old pilot perhaps the first thing that crosses your mind is this guy going to have a heart attack in the middle of the flight, whatever, right? Obviously, the chances go up with somebody that age. And it might be a prudent thing for you to ask, are there parachutes on board and where are they? That would be much more prudent to do than the guy actually having a heart attack, putting the car into a nosedive, and 60 seconds before you auger into a farm somewhere over Pennsylvania, you start looking for a parachute. So part of the idea of this parachute system is a very systemic approach to understanding how to fix, how to understand mistakes on a track, et cetera. I think the last time we did a podcast, I talked about probably extensively about how fast stuff happens on a racetrack. Turns come up quick, everything comes up quick. You're in a completely different environment when you're at speed. But one of the quickest things that happens, and one of the things you're least prepared for, is a mistake. If you anticipated a mistake, you probably would have the ability to handle it a little bit better, but usually mistakes are last minute things. So part of this parachute system, and the first thing I'm going to talk about tonight, is what to do before you even show up at a racetrack to minimize not only the number of mistakes, but the consequences of the mistakes that you may have on the track. What you do before you go out on the track as a secondary thing. And then, of course, what happens when you make a mistake and how do you respond to it? And all of it's designed to quicken the experience level. Really experienced drivers learn this by rote. They learn it by having incidents on a track and surviving them. And I think for the intermediate drivers out there, especially, if you have an opportunity to think about some of this stuff ahead of time and prepare for it ahead of time, two things are going to happen. Number one, you're going to make less mistakes. And number two, the consequences of the mistakes you make on the track can be severely minimized. To put this in perspective, I deployed this in my own driving career, and I don't want to over exaggerate my driving career. It wasn't a great driving career, but one of the things that happened around 1994 is I had essentially reached a point where I was fearless on the track, and I felt like I could handle 100% anything that happened on a track while I was on it. Whether it be a spin right in front of me, whether it be losing a wheel on the right rear wheel of the car, whatever the case may be. I had that for 1 year. I never had it prior. And after 1994, I never had it again. And one of the things that I realized is I went into 1994 having had a lot of experience, a lot of things happening, and I had developed, as I did in many parts of my racing life, a systemic approach to dealing with it. So that's what I wanted to share with you tonight. So let's talk about fear really quickly. 90% of the population doesn't admit it. And what most drivers do is drive 90%, so they leave themselves a little wiggle factor. But let's face it, success in racing, success in performance driving is all about trying to drive the car at its limit, essentially to reach the thresholds of the car's braking, acceleration, and cornering capability. The problem with driving a car at 10 tenths, which is what the threshold is if you have a fear of accidentally getting to 11 tenths, you're probably not going to explore 10 tenths. You're going to keep it at 9 tenths. If you develop an ability to minimize mistakes out on the track, that on the other side of the coin will allow you to more frequently, if not all of the time, explore the car's thresholds. So that's what this is about. And for tonight, I broke it down into 3 or 4 different categories. The first being your mental approach to begin with, being in a race car. The last thing that drivers learn is discipline. It takes a long time to not get panicked in a car. These are 2 critical parts. And the third component is to never give up. During all the years that I taught schools, I told a lot of stories. Usually the driving stories were negative in the sense that I did something wrong, because that's where the most learning value is. I don't think it pays to tell people about all the great things you did to win a race. But to give a perspective about not giving up, I can remember being in the air for about 6 seconds at Road Atlanta under the bridge. And I had in the back of my mind that I was going to hit the wall when I came down at a 90-degree angle, which for most people, they understand that that's about the worst way you can hit a wall. But I also realized I was going to land probably just before the wall. And if I got a steering input, even a slight steering input, that 90 degree could be 70 degrees, and it could make the difference between walking away from an open wheel accident and not walking away. I also had in the back of my mind, I can remember being in the air and having in the back of my mind being taught by teachers earlier on that if you're going to hit a wall, take your hands off the steering wheel. And I made an adjustment right away there while I was in the wall. I took my thumbs out of the spokes and I held onto the steering wheel. And when I landed, I got about 6 degrees of steering into the car. And it made the difference between being bruised and being crippled. So never give up. These are some of the things that you think about before you get in a car. Peter Kuhn, 1980 Super V championship, who has since passed away, from New Jersey, by the way, was one of my early mentors. And I remember Peter Kuhn telling me, every time you put your helmet on, get in your race car like it's another day at the office. You have to have that calm, that everything that comes up that day is like a phone call or a secretary or administrative person coming in and asking you a question, and you have to be very methodical in your approach. And he was the first person that really gave me an understanding of what your mentality had to be in a car. So one of the first things I like to tell people is start to develop that mental approach to racing. Don't get in the car all excited and all giddy and allow your adrenaline to control you, what Skip Barber used to call the red mist. Get in the car and be very, very methodical, but be prepared. I spent 2.5 hours today preparing for this little podcast that we did tonight. And I can tell you, I'd be panicked right now if I didn't do some of that preparation. Secondly, having Dyke as the guy that's going to ask me questions and guide me along really makes it easy for me. So this is all part of the pre-preparation for what I'm doing now. Drivers have to approach it the same way. So here's some of the things that you want to think about. First of all, as I said, never panic, never give up. Try to have a low level of excitement when you get in the car. It's great to love this sport. It's great to get all excited about it when you're having a beer at night, telling your stories with great verve. But when you get in a race car, you kind of want to be calm and you kind of want to have a very methodical approach to it. There's no room for panic. And I'm sorry I'm telling a lot of crazy stories tonight, but I'm going to tell one more just about the panic issue. I remember being on a Harley Davidson in West Palm Beach, and there's an intersection, Military Trail, and I forget what the other road was, Okeechobee Boulevard. Real crazy intersection. And I ran a red light in Harley Davidson. And about halfway through the intersection, I realized I was in deep trouble. I mean, deep trouble. If you know how people drive in Florida, you can imagine. I calmly checked my mirrors, calmly checked everything, got through the intersection, pulled over, and then did what I did in my pants afterwards. And I remember it was a very, one of those moments where I realized that everything that I learned on a racetrack was now applying in real life, that I was able to control the emotion and the panic that I should have had, get myself out of the situation and let myself go after that. And that's exactly what you have to do on a race car. So these are things, the discipline and the low panic and the methodical approach are things that you have to develop in yourself as a driver before we even get to this other stuff, which is how to fix mistakes out there. So here's how you start to think about pre-planning for your mistakes. Number one, everybody should do a track walk. A lot of people do. A lot of people go out on a track, they look for curbing and they look for a lot of things that's going to make them faster. But one of the things they rarely look at, and Dyke, maybe you can bring this thing up with the guardrails. One of the things they rarely look at is what are the escape routes? What happens if I go into a corner too fast, too early, too late? What do I do? How do I get out of the problem? And step one is knowing your racetrack ahead of time. Okay. If you look at Lightning, for example, in New Jersey, excuse me, it's a typical track where civil engineers did more of the work than racing people. And the thought is always, well, if you go through a right-hand corner and you lose it, you're going to spin to the outside. So New Jersey Motorsports Park, at least at the Lightning course, put this huge amount of runoff area on the outside of every corner. Simultaneously, they put no runoff area to the inside of corners. I challenge anybody to go to any track and do a track walk and tell me they don't find that most of the rubber leaving the track goes to the inside. So one of the things you analyze when you're looking at a track, okay, is how far is the guardrail on the left, how far is the guardrail on the right? As we're going to see in a few minutes, that may determine how I try to get out of a problem. What does the curbing look like? Will the curbing catch me if I'm a little bit early in the corner? Will the exit curbing catch me? Is there a giant rut behind the curbing that's going to hook one of my tires and cause me to have an issue? And even more importantly, and something most drivers miss, is there something on the track, something almost hidden if you don't do a track walk, a high grip moment that if you get in trouble, you can count on getting to and being able to add steering or at least getting a car more under control. Speaking of Lightning, there is a dish 2/3 of the way through the light bulb there. And if you go into the light bulb, I forget the number, Dyke, I think it's turn 9. Okay.
Just so you know, I'm just getting the sharing turned on. I'll be with you in a second.
I'm talking fast tonight, aren't I?
You're doing great. Okay, I've got it now.
Okay. You cannot, while walking the track, you cannot, while driving the track, know that there is a little compression about 2/3 of the way through the light bulb where the grip goes up. I happen to know because I've driven very, very low slung formula cars through there, and a car will actually scrape going through that particular section of track. But there's been a couple of times where and I'm sure a lot of other people out of watching, have had the car going through the light bulb very quickly start to skate a little bit on them, okay? And all of a sudden it stops skating. And they may not know why, or they may know why. It's that little dish that will catch a car if a car is starting to slide going up the hill. So knowing those subtle nuances on a racetrack are incredibly important. The apex at turn 7 on Lightning, huge camber pocket, which allows you to add steering if you're in trouble. In fact, you should get in the habit of adding steering there anyway. It just makes the corner a little bit easier, but we'll get to that in a few minutes.
We're good to go. I think the way it's set up now is if I talk, you should see my screen. I don't see it showing up. I see myself talking.
I do. I see your screen, and it's showing the guardrails being very close on the inside of a corner and very far away on the outside of the corner.
Good. That's one example. You brought up some other examples. One of the ones that people that just came back from VIR might be familiar with is infamous turn 10.
Yeah.
So if we zoom in here.
Turn 10, getting off the topic just for a moment. Turn 10 is one of those corners that for a lot of cars is flat out, but here's where the fear comes in. If I screw it up by 1 foot, what's going to happen to me? First of all, if you look at turn 10, and by the way, we would be traveling from the top of the screen down to the bottom for those of you that don't know that corner. You can see rather dramatically that if you spin to the inside, you're going to collect a guardrail pretty quick. If you spin to the outside, you can kind of go for a real long period of time, even though it's downhill and you might get a little airborne. But the real interesting thing about turn 10 is, Dyke, if you can show right by the apex curbing.
Yep.
Just before that curb starts, And probably almost to the end of that curve, there's a little pocket of camber, okay? When I drive that track, even if my car is performing well and I'm able to do it flat out, I always add just a touch of steering there as a safety mechanism. By adding a tiny bit of steering, I'm essentially making sure that the exit of the corner is going to be a little bit easier for me to handle. So that's what I'm talking about, knowing a racetrack and knowing some of the things on the pavement and in the layout of the track that can help you before or if you get in trouble. So knowing the track is really, really important. Second is knowing your car. If your car is what we call tank slapper happy, if there's, especially with a lot of Porsches, if there's a lot of weight extending past the rear axle, that factors into how well you can correct mistakes on a track. So you need to be intimately familiar with your car. Burl Roosh used to use a term, every time I go to a track, I rough my car up. Now you have to excuse Bertel, he had very limited English vocabulary, but what he was trying to say is I will throw the car around in slow corners so that I can feel, and this is going to be one of the questions I'm sure you ask me later, I can feel what kind of yaw angles I can get the car into before it breaks loose. A place like Monticello Motor Club has a really safe skid pad that you can do that on. So this gives you a feel for, in many ways, for what the car's capacity is in knowing your car. And then the third thing you have to know is you have to know yourself. Car control is a learned skill. It is also one of the few areas in racing that I believe is a given talent. There are people that just have a good talent for it. 95% of race car driving is a teachable thing, but people who have a feel, it's important. And you need, when you're racing, to know how much feel you have and to be honest with yourself. There are people that I've coached where I tell them, you get in trouble, spin the car. And we'll talk about that later. There are other people where I encourage them because they have such excellent car control, such excellent feel for the car, that I tell them you should never have to spin. So knowing yourself, knowing your car, knowing the track are preambles, if you will, to this parachute system, to know what you've got in your capabilities going into the game. Okay.
All right. Hey, Dennis. So we figured out, we talked about what we're going to do on track. I think one of the mysteries is what is an early mistake? Where is it? What does it feel like? You know, how did I get into a brake lockup? When and where do I know if I'm online or offline at turn in? How do I know when a little bit of yaw in the car is good versus bad? And if after we go through that, if you could lead us through how the parachute system walks through each one of those situations.
Okay, let's start with the first thing. The most critical two pieces to getting out of trouble on a racetrack. Number one is early identification. Okay, early identification means that the minute you turn into a corner, when I say the minute, I mean the half second that you turn into a corner, if your eyes are working properly, you should be able to determine, was I 2 feet late, 2 feet early? Was I on time? Is the car telling me that I carried too much speed into the corner? Those are three things we're going to talk about fixing before the night is over. But the first and most essential thing is to early identify it. Why? Because if you turn into a corner, a typical corner, you have 75 yards of pavement to fix a problem. If you don't identify the problem till you're past the apex, your options are running out very quickly. And if you do try to make a correction, a line correction, a race line correction, you're going to have to do it in a very short distance, which means it's going to be a more dramatic input to try and get it done. The more dramatic the input is, the more likely it's going to blow up in your face. So I made a habit, and I do this in the school too, by the way, the schools that I teach. The minute you turn your hands in, okay, if you're using proper ocular driving technique, which I'll explain in a minute, you should be able to determine, did I just turn in late, early, or too fast? time to go into correction mode. Okay. There's a second point at which you ask a question, and that's at the apex. The reason you ask that question again, am I online or offline, is because you may have lied to yourself the first time. Now you're further into the corner. Now you're really seeing the outcome of what you did. And it's quite likely that the answer may be a little different than what you got the first time. Also, if you've already made a correction, the apex will tell you, quite honestly, whether the correction was enough. Okay. Now, I mentioned ocular driving techniques. I've already mentioned it 3 times. And for those people, and I know a lot of your members have been to the Bertle Roost School, you know that we incredibly emphasize eyeballs and sight. You cannot know you're late or early if you're not looking through the corner. If your eyes are staring at the turn-in cone or the turn-in reference point, whatever you're using, you're not going to realize until another 2 seconds whether you actually did it right or not. And 2 seconds is 3/4 of the corner and probably too late to affect a change. So that's the first part of ocular driving technique, to see the whole corner. And by seeing the whole corner like the sights on a gun, you're going to know whether you're hitting your target or not, or whether you have to make a change. And everybody should bear in mind, I don't want to get that diagram up again, but it's a big difference to having 75 or 100 or 150 feet to affect a very small change to get yourself back online versus finding out 10 feet or 20 feet after an apex and having to really make a massive steering input or do something else that we'll talk about later to make that change. The second part of all of this, you will go where you look. It has been said 6 million times in racing, and probably 5 million times people really don't understand what that means. It means that you have to be disciplined enough, whether you're sideways, whether you're doing a 360, whether your hair is on fire. You have to be disciplined enough to never let your primary vision leave the positive safety zone of the race line. It has to be on it at all times. Now, somebody might ask, well, if you're spinning a card, Dennis, how can you do that? That's where peripheral vision comes in and a lot of other things. You must be physically in touch with the race line, even when you're in big trouble. One of the great stories in racing is the Danny Sullivan spin and win. And I got to know Danny Sullivan because he was kind of a New York cat for a while in the racing world. And so in early stages of my driving life, I got to know him a little bit. And Danny was a pretty confident guy. But when he talks about the Indy 500 spin and win, if people don't know what happened, by the way, I think it was turn 1 in Indianapolis. He did a complete 360 while leading the race, gathered the car back almost without losing momentum and continued, and lost 2 spots and wound up winning the race later. And it's known as the Danny Sullivan spin and win. And when I talked to Danny about that, he said I was totally lucky. One of his few moments of being really modest. He says, I was really lucky, but I've studied that tape 100 times. And what Danny Sullivan did was twofold. Number one, when you spin a car, you immediately, especially in a formula car, you immediately drag out speed quickly. A formula car spinning, even if your foot's on the gas, will lose 40 miles an hour really quick from scrub. It's just the way they are. So he did a 360. He lost a lot of speed so that the car actually had the capacity to take a steering input. But the most important thing he did, when he got to about 270 degrees, I saw his head go and look down track again. And he did a wiggle here and a wiggle here, got his foot back on the gas and saved the car. A similar, not so happy story was Gordon Smiley years ago at Indianapolis, over exaggerating his skill set. Okay, got sideways in a corner, tried to counter steer correct, and launched himself right into the wall. 2 different ways of approaching things. And if you look at Gordon Smiley, not that you really want to see this, but if you look at Gordon's, because he did not survive, if you watch his head, he was staring straight at the wall as he headed towards it. Okay, so all of these little things mount up to reducing Racing will never be 100% safe, but they all wind up helping you reduce the probability of a large incident. So ocular driving technique plays an important role of that. So we've mentioned two important things in this parachute system, or three important things. A lot of pre-thinking, a lot of mental discipline and what to do before you show up at a racetrack. And then when you do show up at a racetrack, getting information about the track, whether it's a new track or a track you've been at a million times but never looked with a critical eye enough. And then the third thing is to reinforce in yourself the idea that you have to have early identification of problems. Think about all the bad things that have happened in your life, not just racing, but things that have happened in your life, broken relationships, whatever it may be. If you knew 2 years earlier where you were heading, you'd have never had that problem. So racing is no different than that. Racing is all about pre-processing information. I think I mentioned in the last thing that we did a year ago, 0.6 of a second it takes the brain to identify something going on in its environment, and another 0.6 of a second for the brain to tell the body to do something to respond to it. 1.2 seconds from the moment you lose a car, 1.2 seconds is enough time for you to be backwards into a guardrail. So 1.2 seconds is not enough, okay? You can reduce it to 0.6 overall, 0.6 of a second, by having pre-planning, knowing where the parachute is, okay? Ask me a question while I look at my notes, Dyke.
Well, we can buy some time. We did a couple videos at Monticello for our members.
Let's look at that a little bit.
Yeah, now that I bring that up, let's see if I'm. All right.
By the way, everybody, this is Dyke driving.
Thanks, buddy. All right. Let's go back to the beginning of that. This one is recognizing you're early, slowing the car down enough to keep it on track. So early, slow it down, save the car, get back on track. So
if you noticed what happened there, and we'll talk about it more in a couple of minutes, what happened, and this was obviously staged so that we could teach. Dyke went into the corner early. He recognized that. What causes a spin? A spin is caused by the combination of steering input and speed overwhelming the car. So he put himself, in this particular case on purpose, into a situation where the car was going to get loose on him and going to leave the race line. That's what happens when you make a mistake. And what he did was one of the slower methods, but one of the safest methods of correcting a line mistake on a racetrack, which was to straighten the car out, slow it up to a point where it could accept a much larger steering input. And then he used the large steering input to save the car and wound up not even dropping a wheel on the exit. So let's watch it again real quick, Dyke.
oh, okay. Don't know which one this is.
That's the one. You
Okay.
can see about right past the exit, he straightened the car out. The only thing, and again, this was staged, the only thing he could have done is right there, recognize it and do the straightening earlier while he's still got much more pavement to use. He actually did a pretty good job there as I'm reviewing it. It's called straight and slow. I'll talk about it more extensively in a few minutes. Go ahead, Dyke. Let's see what else you got. Are we getting any questions yet?
Don't know.
Okay.
All right. This was an example where, again, another early apex. The notion was, I ain't going to make it. So didn't get the car slowed down enough and just straighten it out so that I could keep the car straight, drive it off into the grass, and save the car. So here's the steering adjustment. Here's the straight. Slow the car down, get it back into track. just before we go much further on that, let's see if I can zoom to this section and stop it. You'll notice these tracks on the right. Those were people that tried to hold the car in, and a classic lift throttle oversteer. And you'll again notice the proximity of the tire wall on the inside of the track versus on the outside of the track. To the life of me, I don't know why track designers do this, but you see it more and more. You have a lot more room to recover the car normally on the outside of the track. The exception being something like Watkins Glen, where you don't have room on either side. I shouldn't say that. So turn 1, turn 10 now, plenty of room. Turn 8, plenty of room. Yeah, if you need to, drive the car off on more of these modern road courses that we go on, you really straighten down the car, get it slowed, check your mirrors, come back on track. I can't remember, was it Skip Barber where he called it CPR, correct, pause, and the pause is the most important part, and then recover.
Yeah, we've, Dyke, you and I have used in teaching this year a term that I really like, which brings this home about the pause. Almost every track on the outside of its exit curbing has a rut. Think of turn 7 at Lightning, okay? And think of how deep that rut gets during the season, even when they try to repair it once in a while. So we've used this term, stay straight till brown turns to green. And what that basically means, you can't see the rut at 80 miles an hour, but what you can see is color. And if it's brown, the rut still exists. And if it's green, you're now back to grass. There's a perfect example right there. You're now back to grass. And usually grass is even with the track surface. The rut is below the track surface. And for anybody that wants to know why that's so critical, picture dropping 2 wheels in the right-hand corner, okay? And the reason all those skid marks that Dyke just showed exist. You try to yank the car back on a track, and what happens is the front tires cooperate because they can steer, they can turn. Your right rear tire in the right-hand corner might cooperate because it may still be on pavement, but that left rear will get in that rut. And while the other 3 tires are going one direction, it's going to go straight, and that's called a spin. The second thing drivers do in panic mode is they lift off the gas pedal. Most of our drivers that are watching tonight know this, that if you unload the back of the car has much, much less grip. And then the third thing that they do is they yank the wheel feverishly, and that causes them to go and start spinning to the inside. Now, funny thing happens when you start to spin to the inside. All 4 tires wind up at some point on the pavement, but you're pointing in the wrong direction, and you just increased your grip. And guess what? You're going to continue to go in that wrong direction until you hit something hard. So that's the deal on that.
Yeah, hey Dennis.
Yes.
Little less on the hitting shit hard.
What did I say?
I'd say a little less on hitting stuff hard. Can't you just say, like, unfortunate circumstances may occur? I mean,
okay. Consequential.
I'm only teasing you.
Consequential results. How's that?
All right, that sounds good to me.
Result of high consequence. Let's talk a little bit about actual technique. There's really 3 ways to correct a line problem. First of all, like I said, early identification. Understand whether you're inside the line or outside the line, and whether you're near threshold or not. The first you just showed very eloquently with some of that stuff, Dyke. If you have the opportunity, straighten the car, slow it up, and reconnect with the race line with a new steering input at a lower speed that theoretically the car should be able to handle, okay? The second, that's, by the way, a relatively expensive relative to lost time, but it's very effective. A second way is knowing in advance that you have outs in a particular corner, whether it be an apex pocket somewhere. If you think of the way most corners are, not all, but most corners, okay? The turning the turn in for the corner is usually not the highest grip moment, which means you turn at a speed that may be less than can be handled by other parts of the corner. For example, almost all apexes have a lot of camber in them. So you'll turn into a corner using all of the grip the car has, only to find a spot where the grip exceeds what you need. Well, it doesn't exceed what you need if you need to correct a mistake. So one of the things you do as a driver, and that goes back to the turn 10 at VIR and some other places, is you look for places where you can do a second bite of the apple. Secondly, sometimes, because you do lie to yourself and you do convince yourself you're online and maybe your eyes aren't working well, you should make those little inputs on anticipation of the fact that you might be a little bit offline. It's a safety factor that you can use that causes you, that costs you virtually no time. Okay.
I'll add those pockets. They give you confidence. If you know in a corner that you have confidence to pick up the throttle at the apex, you should be able to think about that as if you're in trouble. That same grip will give you the ability to tighten the corner, to readdress your line. So looking for those little pockets of grip at the slowest part of a turn, really important to squeezing the last couple tenths out. If you're online, that's where you can dip into the throttle a little more aggressively. If you're offline, it's where you can add subtle input, even braking input, and trust that the car's going to be able to handle it, as opposed to the high speed sliding when you first enter the turn, or probably worse, the lift throttle oversteer at the end of a turn.
Exactly. And remember how we started off this conversation tonight. The whole idea is to develop the confidence to be able to push hard on a corner, knowing in advance that you have an out if you push a little bit too hard. That's the way you get confidence to drive. I wouldn't say 100%, not 10 tenths, but let's just say 97%. Everybody, even Lewis Hamilton, leaves himself a little wiggle room. Okay. The idea, though, is the better you get at this, the less wiggle room you both use and need. Those are the critical parts of this. So this whole parachute system is designed to make you a better driver, not just a driver that can get out of trouble. The third technique, we mentioned two already, which is straight, which is using track anomalies to make a second bite at the apple. The other one is to straighten the car, slow it up, and then re-engage the race line with a bigger steering input. The third is the most difficult and maybe one of the few areas where real instinct and talent come into play. So it's not for everybody, and it's not for every car, and that's throttle steering. Okay. Throttle steering is purposely rotating the car in a controlled way and arresting that slide before it becomes a spin. There's a lot of terms for it: rotation, throttle steering. In the Roost world, we used to call it line recovery technique. And what it basically is you're going into a corner, you're at the threshold of the car's capacity to steer at the speed that you're going. And so you need some secondary tool to make the car turn a little bit more when the steering wheel is no longer viable. And so what you essentially do is you find a way to unload the rear of the car. And again, most of your drivers that are watching tonight know this, but having it methodically explained sometimes is good. You want to break the car loose a little bit. And just as the car is about to go into a spin, you want to reconnect the rear of the car so that it's a controlled 5, 10, 15 degree change in direction, not a 360 degree change in direction. And so the first step in that process is to find a way to unsettle the rear of the car. And there's three ways to do it. Number one, if you're a driver like me, I am generally back on power the minute I turn my hands into a corner. That's the way I design my race line and the way I set up my cars. I am a back to gas immediately type of guy, unless the corner doesn't allow it. So I'm usually on power when I do my rotation, and all I have to do is jump off the gas pedal for about 3/4 of a second, let the car move sideways a little bit, and then back on power and reconnect it. And sometimes, for example, at the carousel at Monticello Motor Club, which is a very long uphill corner, I'll do that 2 or 3 times as part of my driving technique. It allows me to continue to have weight to the back of the car only for a split second, not having it, so the car will rotate. And it makes a very distinct sound called wop, 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 wop going through it. The second way, if you're not a guy that's on throttle early in a corner, is to touch your brakes. The whole idea, we all know about weight transfer and we all know about contact patches. The idea is when you're at heavy cornering G forces, if you can shrink the rear contact patches a little bit, the car will break loose in the back. And if you put the weight back on the car really quick, those contact patches will reconnect. So a second way of doing this is a little tap on the brakes to get the car to turn. And then there's a third, more unique way. And this is for everybody that drives New Jersey a lot. And again, I'm going back to Lightning because that's where we did most of our schools. As we've talked about, I have a very different line through turns 2 and 3. And what those turns do when I do them my way is it puts me all the way to the inside for my turn in for turn 4. Okay. Now, normally that would be a problem turning from the inside of the corner as opposed to the outside. But what I do is I put my left front tire, I smash it against, as I'm braking diagonally, I smash it against that apex curbing and it rotates the car. Don't have to do a little brake thing. I don't have to do an acceleration thing. I don't have to do anything. The car just pivots. It kind of pirouettes a little bit, 5 degrees. You got to learn to do it just right. And it gives me an extra 10 degrees of steering input going through that corner without having to use the steering wheel. And it makes turn 4 as fast for me as the guys that run a traditional line. Of course, backstream, I've just done the previous 2 corners, 25 or 30 miles an hour faster. So this rotation technique, when I did serious schools, we taught it not only as a correction thing, but as a method sometimes of driving a particular corner. But I want to get back to the topic here. This is a perfect way. Imagine yourself going into a corner and you realize you're real early. And there's no way, because you went into the corner fast, there's no way that you can just add steering. There's no little pocket of camber available. There's no little tricks that you've got. Boom, boom, with your right foot, the car rotates and you're out. Now, like everything else we've talked about tonight, if you're not staring and really focused on the race line, you'll never get it done because you have to know how much to rotate the car, okay? And you will go where your hands will take you, where your eyes are looking. So those are the...
That's great. Shannon, do we have any questions that came in?
I see we're running out of time.
Yeah, if there's questions and people have want to hear them, we'll answer them.
Hold on. Can you hear me now?
I can.
So we did get a question about when you were in the last slide, where did you brake? No, I'm sorry. Did he brake when he straightened the car out? And that was on the last video you guys were doing.
So if it's the one where I drove off course, no. I straightened the car. I went in the grass, neutral throttle, didn't hit the brakes, just let the speed bleed out of the car, tried to keep the weight as even as I could in the grass and let it come off 10 or 15 miles an hour and then recovered. On the one where I stayed on the track, I was on the brakes until I was going to make that steering correction. I had taken enough speed out of the car. It was slow enough. So I just turned the car at that point. I came off the brake and straightened the car.
And the other question is, does Dennis ever play 10 Years Gone By Led Zeppelin on that guitar?
Not to waste time on some stuff that's very important, but this is a Martin guitar that was specifically built for me by Chris Martin, a friend of mine who owns Martin Guitar. And you can't see it, but there's a Burl Roos logo here. which if some of you are following my private life, you realize I might not want a Burberry's logo on here anymore. But this is an Eric Clapton model that he fashioned this after and designed for me. I'm very proud of it. So I had to get it in the picture. Like, you know, most women want their little kids in the background or their dog. I have to have my guitar.
There you go.
One of my guitars.
How we doing with time there, Shannon? What do you think?
Maybe we go another 5-10 minutes. Would that be good?
Oh, yeah, because I got some questions. Dennis, you ready?
All right, let's go.
I'm ready.
All right. Okay. So we went over all these things in theory. But, you know, in the heat of the moment, you do what you can. There's some things that I've used, couple I was taught by Keith Pear, that are a little unconventional. I want to run them by you and see what you think. Okay. The first is when I have a car fishtailing, I've come to the conclusion, especially in high-speed turns, like wagging its tail coming out of the bank turn at Pocono, that I can't move my hands fast enough to catch up to the oscillations of the car. One time my friend saw this and he said, just loosen your grip and let the wheel actually find its correct path. And the caster and the front wheels will straighten the car, and you just got to be able to re-grab the wheel when the car is straight. I've used that over the years. I don't know if that's for everyone, but that one has served me well. Any comments on that?
Yeah, several. Number one, when you reach a certain level of experience, there are things that might be counterintuitive, things we didn't even bring up today that work for you. And if you can just give me 2 seconds, I want to tell one more story.
Okay.
My first time at the SCCA runoffs in Road Atlanta back in the 80s, coming down the hill under the bridge, the old configuration. My car constantly was getting into a tank slapper situation, and it took a lot of work for me to control it before I got to the bottom of the hill. At the time, I had a coach named Bob Lovenberg, okay? And he gave me 20 ideas on how to get rid of the bobbling oversteer in the car, and none of them worked. My engineer couldn't get rid of it. So one time I came under that bridge, and all I did was I went back and forth like this real quick while under power, and the car settled down, okay? I don't know why. So I come back to the pits and I told Bob Lovenberg what I did. And he goes, oh, I didn't mention that to you? He never knew, okay? An hour later, he was telling his other clients they're all about this technique that he knows about, blah, 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 blah. The only way I can express it is that I confused the car so much it didn't know which way to go. And I know that that's not right. And I really never studied the dynamics of why that calmed the car down. But I used that technique the rest of my racing career, especially in situations where the car wanted to start to undulate. I would just be really quick with my hands and move it back and forth, and somehow the back of the car would settle down. The point of that, and the point of what you just said, is you experiment out there, and you don't sometimes have to know why. You just have to know that it works. And
Yeah,
so
I think that's what I was getting at.
But don't count on it. You know?
Okay, yeah, don't. yes. Another one that that I've used, and it's kind of counter to the brake in a straight line theory, is a lot of times when I'm not threshold braking and I want to drive hard into a corner, I'll initiate a couple degrees of steering angle before I go into the brakes, and then use the brake and the steering to help drive the nose into the corner. I don't see that being taught. I don't hear a lot of people talk about it, but it's again, one of those things that don't always, just because it says be smooth on the steering wheel, well, that doesn't mean be smooth if the car's going to spin. Just because we're supposed to brake in a straight line, that doesn't apply to every situation. Just because you never let go of the wheel doesn't mean that there isn't a chance for you to let the wheel slip through your hand. In the advanced, when you're driving at a higher level, you've got to learn to trust your instincts and your experience and feel what the car will give you, given all the controls you have, whether steering, braking, throttle. So
Agreed.
that's my questions / comments.
Agreed. I would say that's a rally driving technique, by the way. And there are times where that will work on asphalt, and there are times that you should improvise. I think the listeners tonight would benefit from developing this parachute system first and then improvising off of that, because what you were talking about doing comes with a lot of experience, and the parachute system is a way to survive until you get that experience.
Okay. The other thing that we showed a little bit on, but I'm a big proponent of preparing before I go on a track, is the first time I go to a new track, I look at all the mistakes that people have made before me. A great example is the first time I ever went to VIR, I came down into turn one, and all I saw were black marks going straight off into this big field. And, it was kind of a wake-up call that maybe there's not as much grip in this braking zone as I think there is. And I've been practicing and teaching that for years, that, if you're just smart enough to look at what the racetrack's history is telling you and ask yourself, how did that person get there and how not to be that guy, it is all part of that pre-processing and pre-planning.
Agreed, but I'm going to add one thing to it, okay? When you see those marks, you then have to try to figure out why. For example, most people, I just did a coaching gig up at Watkins Glen, and this particular next concept made a big difference to the guy up there. If you look at the braking zone going into turn one at Watkins Glen, there's 3 different elevation changes going in there, okay? You never see skid marks on the first elevation change. You never see them on the second one, but you see them on the third one. And analyzing that, what happens is people reach a certain threshold capability of the car's brakes on the less elevation change part, and then they hold that actually all the way through a braking zone, when in fact that last third of the braking zone, the grip starts to go away a little bit and they lock up. So yes, it's, the first thing by looking at the skid marks is, wow, everybody over brakes here. But the second part of that is why, and why does it only happen in the last third of the braking zone? And it's all because of an elevation change and maybe a 2% drop in grip. So the same thing, by the way, happens going into turn one at VIR. If you look at the elevation changes, VIR, the grip, the elevation changes in the braking zone of 1. That plus people constantly, and it's a visual thing, they constantly overbrake to turn 1 at VIR. It's a much tighter beginning corner than they think. So there's a lot of spiking of the brake at the end. So, but you're absolutely right. Rubber tells a lot. And one of the things, that we have some people that like to turn donuts up at Monticello, it completely screws up my traffic.
Yeah.
When you've got rubber going in weird directions because people were driving crazy and doing donuts and all of that.
All right. This has been great, Dennis. Let me finish with this, since we brought up Monticello a couple of times. Our safety record is stellar. It's always been good. I didn't think it could get much better until you showed up. And the level of expertise and accountability that you brought to that track has made a huge difference. We run competitive races 2 or 3 times a month, and we can go a month without even a rub of the fender. And that doesn't mean that people aren't driving hard. They are really driving hard. And I think most of that is because they're scared to shit to come talk to you.
I do have a bit of a reputation.
All right.
If I can add something to that. and my apologies for anybody that's sensitive to the way I'm about to express this, but too many people think racing is all about the crotch. And the reality is a lot of it's in the head. And one of the things that I hope I brought to Monticello and try to bring everywhere I go in my little Pied Piper racing life here, is that the more you use your brains, the safer you're going to be and the faster you're going to be ultimately. And the word repeatability, which is a big marketing term right now. And that's why I do these methodological approaches. We're being able to repeat and repeat and repeat and never getting caught off guard in a race car. So a systemic approach to it, an intellectual approach to it, and people can get faster and safer. Remember, the race line, by the way, is not only the fastest way through a corner, it's the safest way. So, you know, being addicted to being on the line, seeing the line, and when you slightly drop off of it, getting back on it quick is what it's all about. And literally, and I'm going to say this, and I'll probably get a lot of negative comments afterwards. There is no reason to ever leave a racetrack if you teach yourself properly. We didn't get into some topics tonight about how to spin a car in short distances and all of that. Maybe we can save that for another time, but I literally am a believer and I've spun my share, okay? But rarely do I ever leave a racetrack unless something breaks on the car. And the reason is that I forced myself to learn all of these techniques. And even though fear has creeped back into my life now because of aging and bad eyes, it's the way to lose your fear on a track. When you get to that point where you think you're never totally in control, but where you think you really can control the outcome of different situations, you would be shocked how much more ambitious you get. Okay. Just, you know, that's the way it is. And every driver out there can get better. I'm going to add one more thing. Okay. Part of what I didn't talk about is your physical techniques inside of a car. Okay. So here's a couple of hints. 9.3 on the wheel, light grip, so that you get all the feedback you can from the front of the car, and be uncomfortable in your seat. And by that, I mean no padding if you can get by without it, because you want to be on the bare rocks of the car. You want to feel every pebble underneath you, because that'll tell you what the back half of the car is doing. And then once again, the eyes. The eyes when you're driving well, the eyes when you've got a problem going on, the idea is when the eyes when you're going sideways. Okay. I've spent a lot of time at Monticello because I never drove closed cockpit cars before, but I've spent a lot of time in the last 2 years looking out the side window, and because I'm still looking at the apex. So how are we on time?
I think, what do you think, Shannon? No, I think we're just done.
Yeah, I think we'll have to wrap up.
Okay.
But maybe we could come back to this, Dennis, early next year before the guys get and everyone gets out on track.
Quick promo for myself. I'm going to be available all winter for coaching. And although I charge for coaching, you can call me anytime if you want further explanations on some of the stuff we talked about tonight. I feel bad because I didn't get to some things that I thought would be really good, but I got to the important stuff, and I love sharing the information. That's just that makes me feel great, seeing people pick up on stuff. You don't need to learn some of the stuff by hitting guardrails. You know, you can learn it in advance. As my father once said, right? A smart man learns by his mistakes, a wise man learns by other people's mistakes, and a fool never learns. So I live by that.
I like that. I like that very much. I wish I could use that a bit more. And Dyke probably too.
There's no copyright on it.
All right.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Dyke. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you, Matt. This was wonderful. We'll make sure we post this so folks can see it. And please feel free, Dennis, to share it with anyone you'd like. Thank you both for your time tonight. And thanks to NGR. We had a lot of people on the call tonight. And I look forward to seeing everyone soon. Thank you. Thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Night.
Thanks, everybody.
Good. That was great.